Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be my wrap up for the books that I read in May, and I've started a habit of trying to read books with Fae in them to match the theme for Fae May. I think it's fun. I did end up reading less books about Fae than I had planned. I did read a few though, but there's a lot of other stuff mixed in as well, so I'll go ahead and get started. So I started off the month by finishing a trilogy. I listened to the audiobook for The Book That Held Her Heart by Mark Lawrence, narrated by Jessica Whittaker. This is the last book in the Library Trilogy fantasy series, adult fantasy series. It revolves around this inconceivably vast magical library and two people in particular, a girl named Lavira who's taken in to work in the library as an apprentice, and a man named Ivar who has lived his whole life in the library with his siblings, but is trying to find a way to escape. And their stories are eventually connected. And there are larger forces at work within the library as well. I loved the first book and also enjoyed the second, but this third one was like a 3.5 star. Not bad per se, but the plot really it felt like it really went off in a couple of weird directions that, I don't know, felt like tangential to the central conflict of the story. It didn't actually come across to me that I was really shown the characters' decisions to the choice that they were ultimately being asked to make, and the ending just wasn't very cathartic to me. And yet I did have moments where I was engrossed. I absolutely just adore the magic and world building in the series. The setting is just incredible, and the characters are interesting and variable, and I enjoyed the series overall. Definitely, I'd say more than the author's Book of the Ancestor trilogy, and I do recommend the series. I just didn't love how it all wrapped up, but it was still a fun and entertaining time. Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. This is a historical fantasy about a young professor named Emily Wilde who is an expert in fairy folklore, and she travels to this village to do research on the fair folk who live there, and she's in the process of writing the world's first Encyclopedia of Faeries. And there are a few mysteries and obstacles in her path, including her rival named Wendell Bamblebee, which is a ridiculous name, who is the sunshine to her grumpy. And this was a 5-star read, just like a shining example of my ideal historical fantasy. This was so good, so much fun. It's written in journal entries and has footnotes, which is one of my favorite things in fantasy fiction. There's a romantic subplot that was delightful. The Fae in this book are less like the sexy kind that are common in like modern romantasy, and more like traditional creatures who are, bound by bargains, tricksters, deadly to humans, very tied to nature. And Emily clearly presents as neurodivergent in some way. She has a hard time understanding and reading people, and she plays off just hilariously against Wendell, who is just like peppy and friendly and just charming, and their dynamic is so entertaining. And all of the plot threads come together by the end. This was like a perfect length, not too long. I just have nothing negative to say about this. I loved it, and can't wait to read the next book in the series. Highly recommend. The Toll by Neal Shusterman. This is the third and final book in the dystopian Arc of a Scythe series. It takes place in a time in our future where we figured out how to basically live forever and eradicate disease and sickness so people no longer die naturally. And to control the population growth, there are people called scythes who are tasked with killing people. And the first book follows two scythe apprentices, Rowan and Citra, and sets the scene for the series with hints of corruption within the scythedom. 4.5 stars. This was amazing. It was it's chunky, it was a little long, probably could have been made shorter, but I was just in love with the world building and cleverness of how everything unfolded. So personally, I wasn't upset about the length. It is kind of long, but I just ate it all up. I do think sadly that Rowan was kind of useless and boring by the time this book comes around, but everything else was just so captivating. There's a benevolent AI called the Thunderhead that runs most of the world, and it's super interesting how it interacts with everything, and you meet some new characters that are enjoyable, and time is just like running out at this point in the series when it comes. The ending felt like a Sanderlanche with things just coming together and just heart-racing scenes. And this series just posits so many like philosophical questions, so interesting to think about. It's so compellingly written. I loved it and highly recommend the series. The Thorns Remain by J.J.A. Harwood. This is a historical fantasy about a girl named Moira Jean who lives in a small village in the Scottish Highlands, and one evening she and her friends go into the forest to have a little fireside party, and everyone but her gets spirited away by the Fae, and she has to find a way to get them back from the Fae Lord that she calls the Dreamer. This was a 3.5 star, and in addition to what I just explained, this is also a story about grief. Moira Jean is mourning the death of her fiance/boyfriend, and there isn't so much a romance as there is in a kind of abusive situation between Moira Jean and the Dreamer. This is slower paced and also has a bit of a like repetitive cycle based on how she's trying to get her friends back. I don't know that her growth as a character is really shown all that convincingly, and elements of the ending were a little unsatisfying. This wasn't really like a fun or feel-good book. There's a lot of things going on against the main character that are frustrating. It's kind of sad and dire, but I did really want to see her succeed. It kept me invested. The folkloric fae were cool and creepy and at times charming, which I enjoyed. I appreciated that there wasn't your typical YA romance, you know, between the human girl and fae lord. It isn't like that. That's not what's going on here. It was beautifully written for sure, and I did actually listen to this on audio, and the narrator Ailey Beaton was fantastic. She did great voices and had, of course, a lovely Scottish accent that was very immersive. So I did enjoy this overall, even if I did have some critiques. Butcher Blackbird by Brynne Weaver, narrated by Joe Arden and Lucy Rivers. This is a dark rom-com about two serial killers, Sloane and Rowan, who meet at the site of a murder and just like to take a shine to each other right away, and they decide to meet up again in 1 year to compete and see who can find and kill their target first. And of course, they fall in love. And this was like a 3.75-ish for me. I am not normally a contemporary romance reader, but I've just kind of seen this going around the last year or so, and the whole serial killers thing sounded like a dark, entertaining twist. And honestly, like, for what it was, I did enjoy it. It's an easy read, something you can like turn your brain off for. The audiobook was good. Joe Arden has a nice Irish accent. And I typically don't care about smut very much in books, so like those parts were fine. Like, you know, very horny. Plenty of, you know, like dirty talk from Rowan. It did take a surprisingly long time for the sex to happen, actually. I was definitely expecting it to happen much sooner in the book. But yeah, I chuckled a couple times, and there is some relatable stuff about anxiety and assuming that you know what other people are thinking about you. So that does mean there's some miscommunication going on that creates drama, which can be annoying to some. I sometimes don't love that. It can be just more frustrating than entertaining. I do plan to continue the series. Actually, the next book follows Rowan's older brother and Sloane's best friend as the couple, and I kind of want to see, you know, how that shakes out based on their personalities. So yeah, this doesn't take itself too seriously, which was good and worked in its favor. Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. I did listen to this on audiobook, which was narrated by Christine Vam. This is an urban fantasy about a girl named Carew who goes to an art school in Prague, and she was raised by a group of creatures called Chimera, and she doesn't know much about where she came from, but that changes when she encounters a man named Akiva, who she finds herself drawn to. And this is an older YA fantasy from 2011, and I just gotta say, the cover design just like absolutely reflects that. It just has a vibe, you know, that I'm definitely not drawn to as an adult in my early 30s, but they did release a 10-year anniversary version of the cover of all 3 books in the series that I actually love. I think they're gorgeous. However, this was like a 3.5 star for me, so like not bad. And I don't think that I enjoyed this enough to go out and kind of buy those editions. I was kind of hoping that I'd have an excuse to. I really liked the first half-ish of this, learning about Carew's life and the magic that's tied to wishes that come in different like denominations of kind of currency. There's the Chimera, which are like human-animal hybrid demons, and there's the Seraphim, who are like angels, and there's a war going on between the 2 races. Just lots of really cool world building, and I liked Carew. And then halfway through, there is this insta-love situation with her and Akiva, which I didn't like or believe or care about, and after that, it just really dives into their romance for most of the rest of the book in a way that I just wasn't expecting. The writing is beautiful and lyrical, but I'm on the fence on if I want to continue this series. I think I'm going to unhaul this, and if I do decide I want to continue, I can either use my library. I know that they have it. Yeah, I'll just do it that way. I do highly recommend Laini Taylor's Strange the Dreamer duology, though. It's fantastic. The Bees by Laline Paull. I'm going to call this fantasy sci-fi. It's about literal bees, specifically a worker bee named Flora 717 who is abnormal and finds herself moving through the ranks and roles of her hive. And this doesn't have like a traditional plot, I don't think. This is more like a slice of life of this bee, and so much of this book is based on real life bee facts, like their social structure, just how they live and communicate and navigate, but it's told in a very fantasy sci-fi style, and the author anthropomorphizes them just enough to be relatable and understandable, but it's also like just, you know, alien and animal enough that you never forget that they're bees, they're literal bees, and they speak to each other and have emotions and thoughts, but it's all through the lens of an insect. And this was a 4.5 star read, very fascinating and very fun for me. If there was more of a plot, I think I could have enjoyed it even more. I tend to prefer plot-focused reads over like character-focused slice of life stuff, but I did really enjoy it in this case. This was very novel, and it has these surprising moments of violence, which, like, I mean, this is the animal kingdom, so it makes sense. And there's also just some very salacious and sexual just descriptions and verbiage, which also makes sense for animals. Kind of startling though, and entertaining at the same time. And there is like a bit of commentary here about the struggle that bees have in the modern day to like find flowers to feed themselves. There's this interesting sequence with a cell phone tower. But like, you know, bees are not humans. So I don't think that the reader is meant to think like, oh, bee society is terrible, we must change how bees live. You know, that's not the point. But like, the allegory is there, I guess, if you want it. And, you know, it's not good to force people into boxes. So I thought this was great, and the author has written a book called Pod, which is from the perspective of dolphins, which I am definitely interested in reading after checking this out. And the last thing that I finished in May was The Gracier by Kim Liggett. I listened to this on audiobook as well, narrated by Emily Schaefer. This is the story of a girl named Tierney who is 16 years old, and in the oppressive patriarchal society where she lives, when girls turn 16, they're sent out as a group to this island to spend the next year, which they call the grace year, surviving on their own and like purging themselves of the magic that lives within them, that their society believes gives them the power of like youth and seduction. But not everyone survives the grace year, and no one who returns talks about what happens there. And this was a 4-star. This had more horror elements than I was expecting. It reminded me a lot of Wilder Girls by Rory Power, but I actually liked this better. It had a lot to say. It's about the silencing and oppression of women and girls. It's about controlling women and girls, about that shift from girlhood to womanhood that's a mixture of like joyful and also terrible sometimes. It's about groupthink. It's about resisting in any way that you can. I thought that it was a powerful read. I wasn't a fan of the romance that happens. That whole section of the book kind of felt out of place to me. Like, the way it was so isolated from what was going on. The foil to Tierney is a girl named Kirsten, and she was insufferable and I hated her. Just got to get that out there. And like, in the end, she's, you know, a victim of this society as well, but she's also just crazy and cruel. So yeah, this was a solid horror dystopian YA novel. Not the most uplifting read, again, but there is hope to be found by the end. And those are all of the books that I read in May, so I think I only managed to read like 2 Fae books. I think it was 2, maybe 3. So not as many as I was kind of planning, but I had a bunch of other things kind of that I was reading in April that I finished in May, so it made it onto the list. But yeah, got a lot of stuff done, and got finally glad that I finished a couple series, the Library Trilogy and the Arc of a Scythe, so that always feels good to finish a series. So right now, so it's June, and I think technically it is still spring, but it'll be summer pretty soon. Right now I am listening to the audiobook for So Let Them Burn, which is a dragon fantasy based in, I think it's Jamaican culture. Then I'm reading on Kindle for book club this month a book called The Water Outlaws. I don't remember the author, but it's like a historical fantasy about taking down the patriarchy, and it is queer, so I'm going to be reading a lot of LGBTQ books this month in June. And the last thing I'm reading physically is I need to finish up a book called The Duke I Tempted, which is a historical romance. So next month, I've read a couple kind of contemporary or just romance books, because earlier in this video I said that I'm not a contemporary romance reader, but I went on this little kick of trying to find some romance books that are, you know, primarily romance focused that I enjoy, and I have some kind of specific criteria that I'm looking for. And The Duke I Tempted, it's not turning out quite as heavy of the elements that I was hoping would be in it, but I am actually just kind of enjoying the plot. And I think that if there is a genre of romance that I could say that I do enjoy, I think it could be historical romance. You know, I watched Bridgerton, and I know the new season will be coming out soonish, whenever, but I did enjoy Bridgerton, so I think that historical romance could be something that I enjoy. So those are the things that I'm reading this month, and I hope that you enjoyed watching, and let me know if you've read any of those. And like the Arc of a Scythe, that's like an old, it's kind of, well, old. I think the last book came out in like 2017 or something like that, in the 2010s. So that's kind of older, but let me know if you've read it. I don't know if people are still talking about that series or not, but I thought it was just incredible. I highly recommend if it sounds interesting to you. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed and found some good recommendations, and I will see you guys in my next one. Bye!